Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast. We cover everything Major League, from spring training to the World Series. We've got your favorite club covered, from New York to Boston to LA. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast.
Hello and welcome into another edition of the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Kevin Mahalik. Today is Monday, September 21st, and this is episode number 301 of the Baseball Podcast. That's pretty crazy. Already past episode number 300. Feels like just yesterday I was talking to you guys, and it was episode number 200. So we've been coming at you fast and furious here the past couple of months with baseball and content every day, and we are starting to wind down the regular season. We are 1 week away. This time next week, when I'm recording for you guys late here Sunday night, the regular season will officially be over. We will know who will be in the postseason. We'll have all the matchups. We'll be breaking down round one, the wild card round. Monday will be an off day, and then Tuesday will be playoff baseball, and that'll be a fun next couple of weeks discussing all of that with you guys. But off the top of the show here, because of that, I just wanted to give a shout out to everyone in Major League Baseball, because early on, right out of the gate, when this season started, it did not seem like we were going to get a full Major League Baseball season in. I mean, we had a Marlins outbreak the first weekend. I think it was before the regular season games. It was during the exhibition games. They had a breakout after the first weekend. Then later we had the Cardinals team have a breakout. And since that point, things have really tightened up. And I want to give a shout out to all the players, managers, everybody involved with the traveling parties, home fields, execution of the games, to continuing to be safe, continuing to make quality decisions, and allow baseball to continue here. And it does feel like, and based on everything that I've just looked at and we're going to discuss over the next hour or so here, is that every team is going to get 60 games in. I know there were questions early on about whether or not some teams were going to be able to make up a certain number of games, but winding things down here, yes, a few teams have doubleheaders left during the last week of the regular season, but everybody's going to get to 60 games, and that's a credit to everybody involved with Major League Baseball. And discussing 2020 with a few different players who I talk to on a pretty regular basis, I want to give them a shout out again, because I know this year has not been fun for the players. Just talking to a few guys, some on the record, some off the record, but basically discussing the travel and being in the hotel and how Major League Baseball will have people located in the lobby waiting for somebody to go down or break quarantine, so to speak, or even go down to the hotel lobby to have an adult beverage or some dinner, things along those lines. So when people are traveling, they're in a hotel room, they're staring at the wall, they're staring at the ceiling. There's not a lot going on outside of the ball game that day. It's pretty much hotel, bus, ball game, hotel, bus. That's pretty much everything that's going on there. So for them to stay disciplined, for them to get through the season, now, of course, they don't get paid if there isn't a season, so there's quite a bit of motivation for these individuals to stay quarantined in their hotel rooms. But certainly human just intuition tells you that it's hard not to open the door and go for a walk. It's hard not to go to the lobby. I mean, I would probably find myself pacing the hallways, if that's even something you're able to do, and you would probably advise against it because you don't want to go into any elevators you don't have to go into due to just common walk space outside of Major League Baseball players. It's just a fascinating season, and for it to almost be at completion, for the tests to have stayed very minimum in the positive world since those outbreaks a few months ago. And this next week, the players, we touched on it in past episodes, have agreed to a bubble-type scenario for the postseason. So the week-long quarantine will start for the players and their families here in the upcoming days, which again makes me believe this would be our last chance to have any sort of positive outbreak, because from the next couple days moving forward, all the way through the postseason, we've seen from the likes of the NBA and the NHL that bubble scenarios do work and, in fact, can eliminate positive tests. So I do not anticipate any positives during the postseason. So I just wanted to take the first 5 minutes or so of the episode, give the players, everybody involved, a huge shout out, because I myself, as a fan, somebody who covers the sport for you guys out there, I very much appreciate it that we're still playing and that we didn't start and stop and have to cancel and start to get into our off-season programming sooner than the month of November. So shout out to everybody involved one last time. But like I touched on it, with 1 week left in the regular season, I want to hit on some last-minute injury news and notes that are coming out here involving a couple of playoff teams. And the first one was that Justin Verlander, it came out this past weekend, that he will need Tommy John surgery. He was trying to mount a comeback. We talked last week that he got up to about 50, 60, even reports of 75 bullpen pitches or live batting practice against teammates. And, well, we've come to find out that the arm didn't respond to that ramp-up time. It certainly didn't respond, because it was reported he was throwing the full repertoire of pitches: curveball, slider, changeup, fastball. Obviously, off-speed pitches are harder on your elbow and your arm than fastballs are, but his arm didn't react the way it wanted to, which ultimately leads to this decision of getting Tommy John surgery, which is obviously unfortunate, because this will probably mean he misses the entire 2021 season. Based on the timing here, we're looking at September. He's probably going to get the surgery. Let's call it October. It's a 9 to 12 month recovery time from Tommy John. And Justin Verlander, being a bit older in age, I mean close to 40, if not over 40, I think it's safe to say his return time will be on the higher end than the 9 months that some people have returned from Tommy John in the past. And in regards to his contract, he's under contract next season with the Astros for $33 million, but he'll find himself a free agent after that. And as an older statesman, of course, coming off a Cy Young year, bitten by injuries this year, only 1 start, I think it was, early in the year. Not having his stats up in front of me for you guys, but missing basically 2 years due to injuries, over 40. It's going to be very interesting to see if anybody's going to take a flyer on Justin Verlander if he does indeed want to mount a comeback, and we'll see how his body reacts to Tommy John surgery. If this is it, shout out to Justin Verlander, but I certainly don't want to act like if this will end his career. So this isn't an appreciation post or anything like that. Just wanted to give you guys an update and pretty much say it's a shame, because it's fun to watch that guy pitch, especially in the postseason the past couple of years. It's been pretty electric. And conversely, on the National League side of things, the Philadelphia Phillies, my local team here in Philadelphia, currently fighting the injury bug themselves. Bryce Harper tonight in Sunday's game, he left with lower back tightness or lower back stiffness. They're not sure how much time, if any, he'll be missing moving forward. Of course, they're in the middle of a playoff push that in the National League is a bit more crowded than the American League, but I anticipate he'll miss at least a day or two coming up here, try to get some treatment, stretching, heat, all of that good stuff, and get back in the lineup as quickly as you can. And you can do things to alleviate back pain during the game. I mean, I myself, back in my college days, I had back spasms, and there was heating pads. I was laying down on the bench in between innings instead of being up kind of cheering on the team. I was laying flat on my back on the bench with a heating pad. People were stretching my hamstrings pretty much the entire time to keep me loose because with the weather being a bit more chilly here in the Northeast, things can tighten up even though you were loose early with the weather and not continuing to stay as active as you do in other sports. Things can grab back there, and hopefully in a day or two they're able to loosen things up and keep him in the lineup moving forward because Rhys Hoskins continues to miss time. Rhys being one of the hotter hitters in the Phillies lineup over the past month. He is ultimately, it's been reported that he is looking towards Tommy John surgery himself. However, this one is in his left arm, in his non-throwing arm, and because of this, you are typically, with this injury, still able to swing a bat. So they are hoping to get him back in the lineup sooner than later. But when Shohei Ohtani dealt with this injury, he missed, I think it was 26 days, ultimately, before returning to the lineup. And with 7 days here left in the regular season, there's not that much time for Rhys Hoskins to bounce back and return, so it's certainly going to have to be on the quicker side. And then with the Tommy John surgery on the non-throwing hand, he's hopeful that in the offseason, the return time is 3 to 4 months, which will allow him to be back for 2021 and ultimately not miss any time or extended time for this injury itself. And then lastly, JT Realmuto, who hasn't been in the lineup now for upwards of 8 or 9 days. He did not go to the 10-day injured list. They're hoping to get him back as soon as Monday. I believe that would be 9 days since the injury for himself. But, they don't know. JT Realmuto, it's up in the air. They're hoping for the best. But you're having basically your 3, 4, and 5 hitters at the beginning of the year now dealing with injuries. If you're a Phillies fan, it's certainly a frustrating time to be in a playoff push and be rooting for the fighting Phils. So that wraps up the quick injury talk. Now here, as we close out the first segment of today's episode of the GSMC Baseball Podcast, let's get into a bit of playoff conversation here for the next 50 minutes or so. Let's start out with the American League. And I teased briefly a bit earlier that the National League is a bit more crowded than the American League, which is very true. Many more teams have the opportunity to make the playoffs in the National League, but in the American League, everything is currently about seeding. And this is where typically you guys, faithful listeners of the podcast, you guys know I give an update every Monday on what's going on. Usually the format is East, Central, West, kind of keep you guys updated on the divisions. Well, I want to look at today's episode more along the lines of playoff conversation. I want to have an American League and a National League conversation. And then, next level conversation is I want to talk about seeds 1 through 3, 4 through 6, and then get into wild card potential and dissect some matchups. So to finish off the first segment, let's get into the top 3 seeds in the American League. As we currently stand here heading into Monday, the number 1 seed is the Tampa Bay Rays at 35-19. Right behind them is the Chicago White Sox, a half a game out of that top seed at 34-19. And then you have the Oakland A's, a game and a half behind the Rays at 33-20. So where are these teams going to finish? Let's look at some of the schedules. I basically made predictions for every team on ultimately where I think they're going to finish things for next week. So if you guys don't even want to tune in this week, I'll let you know what's going to happen. Not a problem here. But Tampa with 6 games left. They have 3 at the New York Mets and then 3 versus the Philadelphia Phillies. So a favorable 6 games for the Rays. However, they do face DeGrom on Monday night, if you're listening to this podcast tonight. If not, you guys already know how things went, but I'll take DeGrom in that matchup, and then they close against Wheeler and Nola for the Phillies, so I'll take one of those, which means I believe the Rays are going to finish 4-2 down the stretch here and ultimately wind up this season at 39-21. So let's see how that will compare to the likes of the White Sox and the Athletics down the stretch. Well, the White Sox, 34-19 currently, have a 4-game series at the Cleveland Indians and then 3 at home versus the Chicago Cubs. So they've faced 2 really good teams here for 7 games down the stretch. They are going to face Savali, Bieber, Plesac, Darvish, Lester. So favorably, I think I have the White Sox finishing here 4-3 with some of these matchups. Giolito, Keuchel, Cease, all of these pitchers going at least one more time. So down the stretch, the White Sox finish 4-3, which leads them to a 38-22 overall record. That would be one game behind the Tampa Bay Rays, and depending on how the Oakland A's wrap up here, we'll see. Let's pull them up. They are currently 33-20, game and a half out of first place, and they have 3 games at the Dodgers and then 4 games against the Mariners remaining for their 7 games. There's a doubleheader on Saturday for the Athletics to wrap things up. And going against the Dodgers, they'll be facing May, Urias, and Kershaw. And then against Seattle, they don't really line up against anybody out there. So I believe 4-3 down the stretch for them is most likely maybe 5-2 because 1-2 against the Dodgers and then 3-1 against the Mariners, I think would be fair down the stretch to ultimately wrap them up at 37-23. And the other reason, slight bias here, just to make things easy for you guys, is because the tiebreakers for an equal record, if they're not in the same division, because that would be head-to-head, is record against their own division. So if the White Sox and Athletics both end up at 38-22, or if all 3 of them end up at 38-22, none of them playing each other, it would be how did the White Sox do against the AL Central versus how did the Athletics do against the AL West? And I don't have those numbers in front of me. So let's just make things simple. We'll say the Rays end up as the number 1 seed. They'll go 4-2 down the stretch and then 39-21. The White Sox, they'll finish 4-3, 38-22, and the Athletics will finish 4-3, both based on schedule and toughness, strength of schedule, toughness of opponents, and the Athletics will be the 3 seed at 37-23. So there you have it, 1, 2, 3 in the American League. They have basically all wrapped up their divisions. Like I said, the White Sox, they're looking to be about 2 games up here with the Twins leading currently Sunday night, and we'll get to where I think the Twins will finish. Then we have the Indians, we have the Astros. Everybody is at least 2 games back. The AL West, 6 games. The AL East, 3.5. So these teams are playing for seeding down the stretch and ultimately matchups against the teams that we're going to discuss coming up here in the second segment. But that'll wrap things up for now here in the first segment of the GSMC Baseball Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Mahalik. This is episode number 300. I appreciate you guys listening out there. Let's pause right now for a word from one of our sponsors and one of our sister shows. But when we come back, we'll wrap up the American League. It's going to be fun. Stick around.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
Welcome back to the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Kevin Mahalik. Today is September 21st, and this is episode number 300. Thanks again for listening, everybody. If you haven't taken the time yet, head to social media. Check out the GSMC Baseball Podcast on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, as well as the GSMC Podcast Network. We appreciate you guys continuing to subscribe, continuing to listen, and that's how we can continue to bring you guys quality content on a daily basis. So if you haven't yet done that, please do so. Share us with your friends, send a text, tell your mom, tell your friend. Playoff baseball's coming. I know I have buddies who aren't even big baseball fans. I continue to tell them, hey, just check out the podcast. You'll know everything you need to know about baseball in 60 minutes. That way you'll be able to talk to your friends, you'll know what's going on, you'll have intelligent conversations, and it'll just make things a lot more fun for everybody out there. But let's continue around the American League. In the first segment, we touched on how the Rays, White Sox, and Athletics have pretty much wrapped up every division and ultimately are fighting for standings down the stretch, seeding 1, 2, 3. And that leads to the next conversation being who's going to be the 2 seed from every division? Who is going to be 4, 5, and 6? And right now, Sunday night, recording this podcast, the Twins are currently leading the Chicago Cubs. So I'm going to go ahead and pencil that one into the win column tonight. I know things can certainly change here, but just for the sake of tonight, we'll say the Twins pull off the victory, which would improve them to 33-22. And would put them 2 games behind the White Sox. So certainly seriously involved with the American League Central. If they get hot down the stretch, the White Sox fade. They could certainly make a run at things. And looking at the Twins' schedule, things could align for ultimately that to happen here. Now, they wrap up tonight with Chicago, then head to have 2 versus Detroit at home, and then 3 versus Cincinnati. So they wrap up with a 5-game homestand. They have Maeda, Hill, Pineda, and Barrios on the mound for those games, but they do face Bauer, Castillo, and Gray over the last weekend. So if they win the game tonight, I think they take the 2 games against Detroit, and then the 3-game set against Cincinnati. If we're looking positive, we'll give them 2 out of 3. 1 and 2 is certainly a potential there, but that would have the Twins at 5-1 down the stretch, or 4-2, even in this instance. 5-1 would have them at 37-23 to wrap up the year. That would put them 1 game behind the White Sox in my current scenario, who would finish 4-3. So basically my point is that the Twins would almost have to win out, because the way the White Sox schedule lines up, I don't see them finishing under 500, which ultimately would get them the division. And the Twins, they're currently battling with the Yankees for the 4-5 spot, because the Yankees right now, they are 31-22, and their schedule down the stretch, they line up against Toronto and Miami. Now, both of these teams currently are playoff teams, but both of them preseason, as well as on paper, not as strong as some of the other contenders. So the Yankees down the stretch with 7 games left, I think it's fair to say they could go 5-2. They take 3 out of 4 from Toronto, win 2 out of 3 in Miami. Cole, Tanaka, Happ, Cole going twice between now and the end of the year. So if they finish 5-2, that puts them at 36-24, which the Twins, if they do go 4-2, would be tied for that 4-5 spot, and ultimately gets back to the conversation we had in the first segment, where tiebreaker would then be Twins record versus the American League Central, Yankees record versus the American League East. And with neutral site playoffs, it doesn't matter based on who the home team's going to be. It's ultimately who's just going to bat last during the 3 games. So that is a big deal when it comes to the actual game, but not a big deal when I'm referencing atmosphere, home field, crowd noise, all of the extra side of things that comes with playoff baseball to essentially just be the ultimate benefit of being able to hit last. So there's your 4-5 coming down the stretch. That's the race between those 2 teams. But ultimately in that matchup, they would go against each other in the playoffs. So it looks like Twins-Yankees is coming together as the first round matchup, but it's going to be a matter of who gets to hit last and who is the home team. Because the 6th seed, the Houston Astros, they're pretty much set in that location of the standings. They're currently 27-26, but firmly in second place in the American League West. They're 3.5 up on the Mariners, but 6.5 back of the A's. They have 3 with the Mariners coming up Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, so they could clinch a playoff spot in those 3 games, which would lock them in and, again, allow them to set their rotation for the postseason, because Zach Greinke going on Wednesday, that allows him to skip the Texas series and line up for Game 1 of the playoffs. Now, playing Seattle and Texas, I do still think Houston goes 5-2 down the stretch, even if they don't throw Greinke more than once, which has them finish at 32-28, a respectable season for a team that's been in a bit of chaos and a bit of turmoil since the beginning of the offseason. So Your 4, 5, and 6 teams are going to be the Twins, Yankees, and Astros, all of them with respectable records over 500. No problem with kind of how the standings are going to align that way. And then we're having the conversation around the wild card teams. And I've said for weeks, we know who the teams are going to be. We have the conversation, and right now Toronto has the lowest playoff chance of any of the 8 teams we're going to discuss, according to ESPN, and that is a 95.9% chance to make the playoffs. So, again, the 7 seed, Cleveland Indians, we see it right here, and this is their opportunity to possibly make a move and push for the division, but ultimately with the other 2 records and where Cleveland is currently at 29 and 24, I don't think the White Sox get there. 19 losses for them. The Twins would only have 22 with their favorable schedule down the stretch. I think we're looking at Cleveland as a wild card team firmly in that 7 spot. And again, with 4 against the White Sox coming up, they have the alignment of Bieber, Savali, Plesac to go against them, and then finish with 3 against Pittsburgh, currently the worst team in baseball. And now it does align with the dates for Bieber to throw the final game of the regular season, but I don't anticipate that taking place because I think they would save him for game 1 of the playoffs. And this is where things could get fun, because if they're currently in that 7 slot, and things finish out the way I had anticipated and the way I talked to you guys about in the first segment, that means the White Sox are going to be the 2 seed. So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, we're going to get Indians, White Sox, and then as soon as next Monday, Tuesday, again, we're going to have Indians, White Sox. So there's going to be a lot of familiarity between these teams when it comes to potential wild card matchups. And the Indians 4-3 down the stretch, maybe 5-2, because again, I don't anticipate them really throwing their heavy hitters in that Pittsburgh series. Either way, 34-26, 33-27. They're not catching the Twins or White Sox, and they're certainly not going to fall behind the Toronto Blue Jays. So basically, Cleveland this last week will be playing the game of continuing to play good baseball, but still getting guys healthy and aligning their rotation so that come wild card weekend, they're ready to rock and roll, even though they're the 7 seed. And the last team, we touched on it, the Blue Jays, 96% chance. They have 7 games remaining, 4 with the New York Yankees, 3 with the Baltimore Orioles. They do have Roark, Anderson, Ray, and Ryu currently aligned to go against New York, but they'll be facing Cole, Tanaka, and Happ in the final 3 games of that series. So a split in New York, potentially losing 3 of 4, winning 2 out of 3 in Baltimore. I have them at 3-4 down the stretch. If you really want to be generous, you're looking at 4-3 for Toronto, which puts them at 31-29 or 30-30 in my projections here currently, which again, 500 or better making the postseason. I cried out earlier that the expanded playoffs, if a team under 500 who doesn't win their division, would certainly be frustrating to watch in the postseason. But the Blue Jays, having themselves a solid year, they've absolutely earned this postseason bid at 30-30 or 31-29 down the stretch here. But with those outcomes, like we discussed, that puts the Rays facing off against the Blue Jays in the 1-8 game for Wild Card Weekend. And now, again, these rotations, I wrote down the top 3 pitchers for each team, but after looking at the starting pitchers, kind of breaking down the end of the regular season, a lot of these teams will be playing matchup baseball, and that's where it gets into the individual outlook and how management and coaching staff, front office, want to manage the regular season and comparatively speaking to the postseason in matchup baseball. Now, is it more important for the Rays to get the 1 seed and ultimately face the Blue Jays instead of the Indians in the first round? And if that is the case, are you throwing Blake Snell on the final day of the regular season, knowing now with no days off in the playoffs, and I think maybe even not a day off between the regular season and the postseason, that he could be burned for a start in the wild card round? I mean, even if, you throw Sunday, Monday's an off day, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday are the 3 games. You're looking at Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. He could possibly be available for game 3 maybe throw 1 inning in game 2. And now in the National League, this is where, again, conversation is going to be fun because people are fighting for their playoff lives and not just their standings within the American League. But if I'm the Rays, I would lean towards throwing Blake Snell in the final game of the regular season instead of facing off in the Indians and possibly getting 1, 2, 3 of Carrasco, Savali, and Bieber, depending on how their rotation lines up, or if they're able to line it up and they go Bieber, Savali, Carrasco, you then have to go Glasnow, Morton, and maybe Snell in game 3 on short rest. So the conversation becomes very tricky, and this is something that we're going to keep an eye on when it comes to Thursday's episode when I talk to you guys again later this week, because we'll start to get a feel how things are falling out. I mean, again, every team has 2 series left, typically 4-3 or 3-3, depending on how your schedule's aligning. And these are the conversations that they're starting to have internally. Now in Houston, once again, this is an easy conversation. You are going to be the 6th seed. So it's just a matter of if you're going to get the Athletics and stay within your own division, team that you've matched up with, again, what was it, 10 times this year already? A team that, again, I don't have how you matched up in front of me, but it certainly looks like that's how things are going to align. Or if you're the Athletics, would it be more important to get the 2 seed and face the Indians, even though that rotation is fantastic at the top, but your hitters don't have familiarity with the opposing pitchers? Is it better to see new faces or go against somebody you may have faced 2 to 3 times this year that has been very successful against you? And the Yankees and Twins, they're going to be stuck right in the middle. I mean, both of those teams really can't creep up to win the division. Neither of them's moving down to the 6th seed. So ultimately here on the 20th of September, unless something crazy happens with one of these teams down the stretch, you're getting Twins-Yankees in the first round. And the Twins, they have a mental hurdle to face against the New York Yankees. I mean, I've been friends with guys who have played for the Twins in the past. Now going into Yankee Stadium has very much been kind of their kryptonite, even when it comes to AL wildcard games in the past, regular season games in the past. Minnesota really struggles in New York City and the Bronx. Now, is this just against the Yankees and in the postseason? Or is it the home field advantage of New York, of the Bronx, of the traffic, of the bright lights, of the constant noise, the constant police sirens outside of the hotel overnight? And that's not a shot at New York City. That's just from personal experience being in the hotel room with some guys until 1 a.m. and hearing the sirens going off while we're just watching the highlights on television. It's a lot goes into it that could potentially be negated with the neutral site, neutral field style of the postseason. But, Rays versus the Jays, Snell, Glasnow, Morton would go against Ryu, Roark, and Anderson. I think that series would be a good series. Obviously, Tampa would have the advantage because Toronto's been scuffling a bit of late, but certainly would be fun to watch. A's, Astros, if they're able to line things up, you'd have Fiers, Bassett, and Minor for Oakland in a 3-game set, going against some combination of Greinke, McCullers, and Valdez on Houston's side of things. And then with the 2-7 matchup and how I anticipated things to go, you'd have White Sox Indians. I would pay a ton of money to watch those matchups. That has been high-quality baseball this entire summer in the American League. You would have Giolito, Keuchel, and Cease up against the likes of Bieber, Savali, and Carrasco. That is fantastic baseball, and I love that it's 2 out of 3 and not best of 1. It allows teams to get a bit of a feel for each other as they navigate the weekend. But Twins-Yankees, Barrios, Maeda, Hill versus Cole, Tanaka, and Happ, these would all be excellent postseason series that I think a lot of people would enjoy watching, and I'm certainly looking forward to. But those are my predictions for the American League. We're going Rays, White Sox, Athletics, 1, 2, 3, Twins, Yankees, Astros, 4, 5, 6, or if you go Yankees, Twins, Astros, that's fine. But there's your 4, 5, 6. 7, 8 will be the Indians and Blue Jays, and the playoffs will certainly be a ton of fun in the American League. But that'll wrap things up for the second segment here of the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the the GSMC Podcast Network. We'll pause right now for a word from one of our sponsors, but when we come back, we're going to transition over into the National League. It's going to be a fun conversation, so stick around, everybody. I'm your host, Kevin Mahalik. We'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back, and thanks for listening to today's episode of the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Kevin Mahalik. Today is episode number 301 of the Baseball Podcast, here on Monday, September 21st. Hopefully you guys out there are enjoying a beautiful weekend. Up here in the Northeast, things got a bit chilly. They got down into the 40s at night, 60-something was the high during the day. We're going to get back into the 70s coming up here next week, but it was football weather, and it was a fantastic Sunday of football. Recording this here Sunday night, the Patriots and Seahawks currently going at it. The Patriots are up 14-7 right now. Of course, you have Saquon going down, the Cowboys onside kick. A lot of action in Sunday football, and if you guys are not just baseball fans, but football fans as well, check out the football podcast. Brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. We got the NFL broadcast, fantasy football, college football is back on Saturday. The ACC is in action. The Big Ten said they're coming back. So there's a lot going on this weekend. We had Bryson DeChambeau win the U.S. Open in golf. That was a lot of fun to watch on Sunday, coming down the stretch there. He played some fantastic golf. So if you guys listening and are saying, hey, this is a baseball podcast, get back to baseball, we'll get there in just 1 second. But if you do enjoy other sports or other activities or hobbies, check out those podcasts within the network. Wherever you're listening to this podcast, whether it's Spotify, Apple, Google, Stitcher, whatever it is, type in the GSMC Podcast Network, and you'll find a ton of different programming that brings you guys great content. Not only sport-related, football, golf, fantasy, all of that stuff, as well as movies, music, books, relationships, all different types of stuff. So check those out. If you haven't done so yet, just type in GSMC. It's a lot of great content from a lot of great people who I've interacted with via social media, things along those lines, and it's a great family here within the podcast network. But transitioning back to baseball now, as I'm recording here late Sunday night, the Twins still have a lead on the Chicago Cubs, and we talked about the American League in the first couple of segments and how that, those playoff teams are pretty much determined. It's just seeding that we're discussing. Well, here in the National League, they have quite a few teams still with a decent chance to make the postseason. And now the divisions themselves are pretty wrapped up. That is very similar to the American League. The conversation really happens when you get into the number 2 spots in the Central and the East, with the Padres wrapping up the 2 spot out West. And then whoever doesn't get those 2 spots is certainly in the mix for the wild card positioning moving forward. And we have, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 teams with greater than 40% chance to make the playoffs here, and not all of those 6 teams are going to qualify. So a lot of baseball left, even though there's only a week here. But the easiest way to kind of dive through the National League over the final 2 segments is really kind of breaking it down into two different tiers. And like I touched on, the tops of the divisions are pretty much set. And the seeding is, well, the number one seed is set. Okay, so the 2 and 3 are yet to be determined. And everybody knows we got the LA Dodgers currently coming in as the 1 seed. They are 38 and 16 after Sunday night. They have, let's see here, 6 games remaining, 3 against the Oakland Athletics and 3 against the LA Angels. Oakland, obviously the top team in the American League West, but the Angels not playing great baseball here currently. So looking at the lineup, just kind of being favorable since they do have the 1 seed lined up. They're going to be working their rotation so that it aligns perfectly with the postseason. So right now, Dustin May is scheduled to start the finale of the regular season, but I don't anticipate that happening. So he could be available for either game 1 or 2 of the playoffs because of the way it aligns right now. They're hoping to have Buehler back on Thursday against the A's, which means Kershaw would throw on Friday. So Kershaw and Buehler would be available for games 1 and 2. And Dustin May could throw the finale, but honestly, they'll probably keep him on a low pitch count because game 3 would align to the 5th day in his turn in the rotation. So basically the Dodgers, they're going to be the 1 seed in the National League, and they're going to be able to align Kershaw, May, and Buehler for their playoff starts. Now, playoff Kershaw, is that a thing? Is that what we're getting here? We'll have to wait and see. Honestly, I root for Clayton Kershaw, unless they're playing the Phillies, but I hope that he bounces back every postseason, but things certainly don't seem to go his way. However, having said that, 4-2 down the stretch, that's a 42-18 overall regular season for the LA Dodgers, and with their stacked lineup heading into the National League, it's pretty much them and everybody else looking at the standings. Now, discussing seedings 2 and 3, because you have to win your division to be seeds 2 and 3. Now, we may have a team with a better record than both the 2nd and 3rd seed, but again, the way baseball is aligning it, this is just the way 2020 is happening. So right now it is down to the Cubs and the Braves. They both have the NL Central and the NL East pretty much wrapped up. Even looking at schedules, it certainly doesn't look like there'll be any team to make a push. The Cubs right now are trailing the Twins, but as of time of recording, they are 31 and 21. Could be 31 and 22 by the time you're listening to this on Monday. Now, having said that, I put a loss in the column here discussing their final 8 games that they have remaining. But after tonight's matchup with the Twins, they have 4 against the Pittsburgh Pirates. And the Pirates being the worst team in baseball, I think it's pretty fair to say 3 out of 4 for the Cubbies against them, if not 4 out of 4. And then they match up with the White Sox down the stretch for the final 3. And again, they will be fighting the Braves for position in the standings and matchups in the first round. So currently having Darvish and Lester going in games Friday, Saturday next weekend, that will allow them to come back in game 1, 2, and 3 because the National League, their opening game will be a day later than the American League. Everybody will have Monday off. The American League playoffs will start on Tuesday, and the National League playoffs will start on Wednesday. So that allows the extra day, so everybody going Friday will then be able to come back on Game 1 on Wednesday. So the Cubs, they'll have Darvish and Lester go against the White Sox, and then they'll be able to come back for Games 1 and 2. But 3 out of 4 against Pittsburgh, 2 out of 3 against the White Sox, and then losing tonight to the Twins has them at 5-3 with a final record of 36 and 24. For my prediction here coming down the stretch for the Cubs. And where does that leave the Atlanta Braves? The Atlanta Braves right now are 31 and 22, could be tied with the Cubs heading into the rest of the evening, and their schedule down the stretch is a bit more favorable. Now, having said that, I just talked to you about how I think the Cubs against the Pirates are going to do very well. The closing series is much more favorable for the Braves, having the Boston Red Sox compared to the Cubs having the White Sox that weekend. But looking at it here, Miami has played good baseball. They have Sixto Sanchez going one of the games. I think you're looking at 3 out of 4 for the Braves against the Marlins. And then 3 out of 4 will go there. And then Boston, it'll be 2 out of 3. So that will finish with a 5-2 record for the Braves down the stretch. That puts them at 36 and 24 for the regular season, which is the exact record I just told you about with the Chicago Cubs. So let's go to the tiebreaker. Let's try to break things down here in regards to how the Braves did against their division and then how the Cubs did against theirs. And as I do a quick scroll through, I'm favoring the Cubs just based on the 10 games that they have against the Pittsburgh Pirates. They swept them early in the year. They took 2 out of 3 later, and they have 4 games coming up where I think they're going to win at least 3. So that has them 7 wins against the Pirates. Let's see, Cincinnati, St. Louis, they've performed well. So without having a final tally in front of me, just due to the Pirates being in the NL Central and being pretty much a punch bag for everybody else, I think those 10 games could be the difference because the Braves, their punching bag is the Washington Nationals, who, yes, they haven't been doing that well this year, an overall record of 20-32 at this point, but certainly nowhere near as bad as the Pittsburgh Pirates. So ultimately, I think that transition makes the Cubs your 2 seed for the postseason, and your Braves in the 3 slot. Now, the number 4 slot team and the second place team is the last team that I would put in this top tier of teams that we know is going to make the postseason. Now, the Padres have already qualified, unlike the Cubs and Braves. I anticipate those teams doing so here in the next couple of days, but the Padres have already clinched with a current record of 30-20, or 34-20 currently. So they have the second best record in the National League, but will ultimately be relegated to the 4th seed based on how the playoffs are transitioning and finishing off here. So looking at the Padres and their schedule down the stretch, I would have them finishing 4-2 in their final 6 games, and this is being a bit positive in regards to how I believe the Giants are going to close, because they have 2 games against the Angels. I think they win both of those games, but already being pigeonholed into that 4 seed with not being able to catch the Dodgers as well as anybody behind them being nowhere close in the standings, I think they look at their rotation and they set things up for the postseason, because right now, according to ESPN, they would have Lamet going Saturday against the Giants, and I don't think that's going to happen. I think they're going to pass on that ultimately so that he could go game 2 in the postseason. Now, I know that wouldn't allow any off days. If we're looking at Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, throwing on Thursday, I just anticipate, even if he does start, okay, so let's say he does start to stay on time, I don't think you're going to get 105, 110 pitches. I think you'll be looking at somewhere along the lines of 75, 80 pitches, looking for a 5-inning outing out of Lamet to have him straight away. And then the first 2 games, a doubleheader on Friday, we don't have any starters listed for San Diego. So splitting with San Francisco down the stretch, give them both of the wins against LA with Davies and Paddock on the mound. I think both of those matchups favor the Padres. So a 4-2 finish for San Diego. That'll have them at 38-22 and finishing with the second best record in the National League, but ultimately the 4th seed for the postseason. And that's the last team that ultimately we know where they are going to finish. And the conversation from here becomes very jumbled and very complex, because as I was going through the standings, I mentioned briefly in passing during one of the first 2 segments, I think it was the first segment where I was talking about and congratulating the players on having a fantastic season. And unfortunately, I was incorrect in stating that every team is going to get 60 games in. There is one team that, based on the numbers in the current schedule, that will be short. Everyone in the American League we talked about is going to make it. The National League, the Marlins, based on their schedule, are going to make games up. But the St. Louis Cardinals and their coronavirus breakout and the amount of games that they had to miss will cost them 2 games when it comes to the regular season. They have 3 games with Kansas City and 5 with Milwaukee on the schedule, and I'm going to get into it in much more detail in the 4th and final segment, because I want to keep the entirety of the wild card second-place teams for its own discussion, because it becomes very jumbled and very complicated, and I want to navigate it as smooth as possible for you guys. But the Cardinals are only going to get to 58 games if the schedule plays out the way it does. And this is where things become interesting, because we talked about it, and winning percentage is going to be the ultimate determining factor. Now, of course, you're not going to have the same record. You're not going to be 31-29. You could be, 31-28 or 30-28. And it comes down to winning percentage because at this current moment, just a tease, Miami and St. Louis are neck and neck when it comes to that 4-5 spot. And I think they're going to be even closer down the stretch. But we're going to get into that conversation in a ton of detail here for the fourth and final segment. That'll wrap it up here for the third segment of the GSMC Baseball Podcast. And if you guys are listening, do me a favor, rate, and review the podcast. I pulled it up here today. We haven't had any reviews in the past couple of weeks, and you guys know I like to read the reviews live on the air and give you guys some airtime. So if you are listening to this and you're enjoying today's episode, I always ask you, text it to a friend. Let a buddy know, let your dad know, let one of your old baseball friends know, somebody you played with, to check out this podcast. We'll be able to keep you up to date on everything that's going on across Major League Baseball. I myself, along with all the other hosts, we love bringing you guys content every day, talking about everything Major League Baseball, and especially this wild card second place division in the NL East, NL Central conversation we're about to have here to wrap up today's episode. That's going to be a ton of fun. So leave a comment, rate and review the podcast. Let me know your predictions. If you listen to the American League and you think the standings are going to fall a different way, or after you listen to the first four, not a ton of confusion there, but this next segment, there's going to be a lot to discuss. So leave a comment. Ultimately, let me know where you think these teams are going to wrap up. But we're going to pause right now for a word from one of our sponsors, one of our sister shows, and when we come back, we're talking about the rest of the NL playoffs. Where are these teams going to finish? Who's going to make it? Find out. Stick around.
Want to know the latest in soccer? Then listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Soccer Podcast. From MLS, the World Cup, and the Premier League, we've got you covered. The latest updates, the hottest matches, and news on the league's top players. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Soccer Podcast.
David Beckham scores the goal to take England all the way to the World Cup finals.
Listen now.
We are back with the fourth and final segment of the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Kevin Mahalik. It's Monday, September 21st, and this is episode number 301 of the Baseball Podcast. Thanks again for listening, everybody. We are talking about the NL playoff picture here, ultimately with 1 week left in the regular season. I'm giving you guys my prediction on how things are going to wrap up here coming down the stretch. Who's going to make the playoffs? Who's going to be left at home? In the American League, we know who's going to make it. It's just a matter of where they fall. But in the National League, there's a fan base or two out there listening right now that is not going to be very happy with my predictions and is not going to be very happy a week from now when I talk to you guys about what actually happened here. But right off the top of the fourth segment, the Twins, they continue to lead the Cubs tonight here late in the ball game. They just went deep, so they got to extend their lead to 4-0 late in the game here. So that lends back to my Cubs prediction of 5-3 and 36-24 coming down the stretch. But let's talk about the number 2 seeds from each division and then how that translates into the wild card, because there's a lot to talk about here. And starting out with the National League East, as of today, Sunday night or Monday morning, when you guys are listening to this podcast, the Marlins are 28-25, and the Phillies are 27-26. So the Phillies 1 game behind Miami for that 2 spot. And based on the tiebreaker head-to-head matchup, Miami would ultimately take that number 2 slot. Based on record against the division, I anticipate Miami would be better based on the head-to-head record. So the Phillies would have to finish a game better than Miami to jump them. But I don't know if it's going to happen. I mean, the schedule aligns for the Phillies to ultimately make a move down the stretch here. I just don't know if they have enough pitching to ultimately make it happen, because the Miami Marlins, they have 4 against the Braves, and they have Rogers, Urena, Sanchez, and Lopez going. I had Atlanta winning 3 of 4 of those games, so that's 1-3 for the Marlins, and then follow that up at New York, where again, I think New York will be battling for seeding. Garrett Cole goes the last day of the year. I don't think that happens. I think they skip Garrett Cole, like I mentioned, for the playoffs. So 2-1 in New York for the Marlins, because they're going to be must-win games for the playoffs and maybe not as much intensity for the Yankees. So that puts them at 3-4 coming down the stretch. That means the Miami Marlins would finish 31-29 for the regular season. Now transition over to the Philadelphia Phillies. Where would this leave them? The Phillies have 4 games coming up at Washington, and then they finish at Tampa Bay for the final 3 games. And now they do have Wheeler and Nola scheduled to pitch for 4 out of these 7 games, and they're going to need to win every one of those starts. Now, I think it's fair to say that they could win 3 out of those 4 starts, which then leaves the other 3 games between Eflin, Velasquez, and to be determined during a doubleheader. If they split the doubleheader, Wheeler wins game 1, Eflin wins. We're talking 3 out of 4 from Washington, and then 1-2 in Tampa Bay, 4-3 down the stretch for the Phillies, which would put them even with the Marlins at 31-29. Again, the matchup there would go to divisional record head-to-head, and I think Miami gets the bump against the Phillies. I think the Phillies would be going into those last 2 games of Wheeler and Nola potentially having to win them both, and I do think that's possible. I think a 5-2 run here down the stretch, Nola in a 7-inning game, Wheeler's been good, but they would have to win every one of those 4 if they want a chance to jump the Marlins based on how they've been performing, and I don't think they're going to go 4-0 in those games. So they end up tied with Miami. Ultimately, Miami gets that number 2 slot, which puts them in that 4-5 or 5-6 mix behind the Padres at that number 4 spot, and it leaves the Phillies to be determined in regards to the wild card positioning moving forward. So let's now talk about the NL Central. I mentioned it. The Cardinals not going to get to 60 games. They're going to be at 58 games. They're currently 26-24, and down the stretch, they have 5 against the Brewers and 3 against the Royals. They have Wainwright, Martinez, Flaherty, Wainwright again. So 2 out of 3 against Kansas City, I believe, is a fair assessment. And then I have them going 3-2 down the stretch in regards to the Milwaukee Brewers series, which would put them at 5-3 in their final 8 games and would put them at 31-27. Now, I just touched on how the Marlins would be 31-29 in this instance, but imagine the Marlins, they do win one more game. They finish 4-3 down the stretch, and Miami's 32-28. This is where things get tricky, because the Cardinals at 31-27 compared to the Marlins at 32-28, they would be even in the standings. And this is where we would go to winning percentage to ultimately be the tiebreaker. And in this scenario, the NL Central champion, runner-up, the Cardinals, they would have a .534 winning percentage at 31-27, and the Marlins would have a .533 winning percentage at 32-28. So the Cardinals would then be the 5 seed over the Marlins in that case. And even if the Marlins go 31-29, they would be the 5 seed. So ultimately, I do anticipate St. Louis being the 5 seed. It would just be fascinating to see it be on a tiebreaker based on winning percentage by .001 to ultimately gain that advantage, or maybe even a disadvantage at this point. If you're looking at matching up potentially against the Braves or Cubs compared to the Padres, are you losing another game if you're the Cardinals? Are you going 30-28? Does that then put you into the wild card conversation? And that's where you may not have that ability to be able to play the standings game in the National League like you do in the American League to play matchups. So let's continue down this road, this projection. We got Miami 31-29. They'll be in as a number 2 slot. And then St. Louis 31-27. How does that one compare to the rest of the division? Okay, well, next in line we have the Cincinnati Reds. They've been fantastic of late. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 out of their last 8 games have been victories. They have 3 coming up against Milwaukee, and then they close with Minnesota. So a bit of a tougher stretch here for Cincinnati down the stretch, but them playing good baseball. And with Castillo, Gray, Bauer, Castillo, Gray aligned in the rotation in these 6 games, I think it's fair to say that they could go 4-2 down the stretch, and that's where they finish 31-29, coming all the way back from a non great start from September 13th on. They would ultimately have only lost 3 ball games and find themselves right in the playoffs. And ultimately, my prediction of the White Sox being the surprise team in the American League, and then the Reds being the surprise team in the National League, would come together. I mean, who would have thought the Reds would be able to put it together and make the postseason? But at 31-29, tied with the Phillies, now we're having ourselves a playoff conversation. Milwaukee is on the outside looking in. They have a 45% chance to make the playoffs. That was the team that was on the lowest end of the spectrum. They do have that 5-game set with St. Louis, where if they're able to win 4 out of 5, we're certainly having a different conversation. But again, based on what I just predicted, Cincinnati losing 2 of 3, and then St. Louis, I think, losing 3 of 5, ultimately puts them at 3-5 down the stretch. And the Brewers, although they're making a late push here because they themselves have won 5 of 6, ultimately do fall short at 29-31. And it's a disappointing year in Milwaukee, but they do have to be pleased with overall how they're pushing towards the close here. And with the opportunity in 5 against St. Louis, their year is not over, and you have to be anticipating that highly if you're a Brewers fan. And the last team to possibly discuss around the playoff bid is the San Francisco Giants from the NL West. Now, San Francisco has 8 games left, currently at 26-26. They have 4 versus the Colorado Rockies and then 4 against the San Diego Padres. Now, their pitching staff lines up nicely. Cueto, Smiley, Webb, Gausman, and then, rinse and repeat moving forward. So, lining them up against Colorado, though, however, Marquis, Freeland, Gonzalez, Castellani, and then San Diego having Lament and Davies lined up to go against them. I think it's fair to say, based on their record and performance year to date, sputtering here of late, having lost, 3-5 in their last 8. I think 4-4 down the stretch would be a favorable outcome based on the pitching matchups and the teams I'm looking at here. And that would finish them at 30-30. And that would put them 1 game outside of the playoffs, because in this scenario, once again, Miami is the 6th seed at 31-29. St. Louis is the 5 at 31-27. And then your playoff teams are the Phillies and Reds at 31-29. The Giants would just miss at 30-30. And then the Brewers would be a game behind them at 29-31. Now, ultimately, who would be the 7 seed and who would be the 8 seed? How does the tiebreaker work again? Based on your record in the division. And for the same reason, I think the Phillies would lose the tiebreaker to the Marlins. I think it's why they would lose the tiebreaker to the Reds. The same reason I think the Braves lose the tiebreaker to the Cubs is the same reason I think the Phillies lose the tiebreaker to the Reds. 1, Phillies' performance against the Marlins. 2, the Pittsburgh Pirates are in the NL Central, and I think Cincinnati has beaten up on them extremely well during the course of the regular season here. So, ultimately, where do I think the matchups go? Well, I think based on this scenario, you'd get the Dodgers versus the Phillies. You'd have a 3-game set. You'd have Kershaw, Eflin, based on how the days align and where the pitching matchups would be. You'd have May versus Wheeler, and then Urias versus Nola, or Walker Buehler versus Nola in a potential Game 3 if Buehler's able to stay healthy and the Phillies can force Game 3? Well, they're going to need Wheeler and Nola down the stretch, but based on the off days, they're able to come back in Games 2 and 3 and possibly make it a series against LA. But the Phillies bullpen against the Dodgers offense, even if they do have a lead through 7-8 innings, they're not going to be able to close that one out, so LA would move on pretty quickly. Then I would have an interdivisional matchup, the Cubs and Reds, based on tiebreakers and where they would align, as well as the Braves and Marlins in the 3 and slick spot. Those teams could flip-flop both ways, but based on the Pirates and their tiebreaker, I give the advantage in both spots to the NL Central. So the Cubbies, they'd go Darvish versus Bauer, Lester versus Castillo, Hendricks versus Gray. That would be a fantastic pitching matchup. I mean, you have the two NL Central Cy Young contenders in Trevor Bauer and Yu Darvish possibly going at it. Yu Darvish gave up 4 runs over 7 innings tonight. So is that award up in the air? Well, we'll get into that conversation on Thursday's episode in a lot more detail. I really enjoy going into that stuff with you guys, as you've known since you've been listening here over the past couple of months. But the Cubs and the Reds, Darvish, Bauer, Lester, Castillo, Hendricks, Gray, that would be a fantastic matchup. I think you would go advantage Cubs just based on the regular season and where things would be. But the Reds coming in hot, and that pitching matchup, that could be tough in a short series for that Cubs offense, which has not been fantastic this year. So facing that lineup, we could get an upset in Cincinnati, potentially moving on. In the 3-6 spot, we'd have an NL East matchup. You'd have the Braves versus the Marlins. And these teams are playing 4 times here in the last week of the regular season. So they could see each other 7 times in 11 days over the course of the next 2 weeks, possibly lining up the rotations. I may give an outside shot to the Marlins, and based on where their odds are to win the series, there could be some serious value there because the Braves rotation being decimated by injuries, and yes, Cole Hamels did return, and I have him lined up to pitch Game 3. It gives you Fried, who's been excellent, against Alcantara from the Marlins ace. Then you would go Anderson versus Sixto Sanchez, who's making a late push here to be NL Rookie of the Year. And then Hamels versus Rogers, which I, again, would favor the Braves. But over the course of 27 innings, I think that's more of a toss-up than we think it is, which is why I think the Marlins could have a chance ultimately with that rotation. And then lastly, in your 4-5 matchup, you have the Padres and the Cardinals. The Padres being locked into that 4 spot, being able to line up their rotation for the postseason, depending on where Clevinger ends up here over the last week or two. You're looking at Paddock, Clement, and Davies potentially going the 3 games, going up against Flaherty, Wainwright, and Martinez. And it's kind of the kids versus the vets. Now I know Flaherty is younger in his career, but he's been around longer than some of these guys on the San Diego side of things. And Wainwright, of course, been doing it for years. But that Padres offense, much deeper, a little bit more talent than the Cardinals side of things. I just think that would be a fantastic series along with the rest of the National League. I mean, we can't complain coming down the stretch here based on the expanded playoffs. We touched on it. I didn't want somebody under 500 making the postseason. Based on my predictions here, 30-30 Blue Jays getting in. And then on the National League side of things, as crowded as it is, it looks like you're going to have to be over to 500 to make the postseason. I mean, the Marlins could sputter. The Phillies could jump them ultimately. Cincinnati keeps playing good ball. I don't think Milwaukee's going to find themselves all the way back, but based on that matchup with St. Louis, 4 out of 5, this thing could be completely backwards. And then the Giants, I don't think have enough pitching ultimately to make a late push here. But let me know if you guys agree. Let me know if you disagree. Reach out, write a comment, DM me on social media, Kevin Mahalik. You can find me on Facebook, KMiho, KMIHO 20 on Instagram, TikTok, across all those platforms. Shoot me a message. Let me know where I'm wrong. Let me know where I'm right. I certainly would love to hear from you guys and ultimately where you think things end up 1 week from today, because next Sunday, when I'm able to record for you guys, we'll know, and we'll be previewing the postseason. I can't believe it's already here. It's fascinating. It feels like it was just March, and we were going off about how we were not going to have a Major League season, and yet 60 games later, or 58 in the case of the St. Louis Cardinals, we find ourselves on the verge of the playoffs here. But that'll wrap it up for today's episode. Like I said, hopefully you guys had a fantastic weekend. Hopefully the start of your work week is off to a good start. If you're listening here on Monday, I appreciate it. If you're catching up later in the week, that's fine. That's the beauty of podcast. It's audio on demand. You guys can listen whenever you'd like. But please share us with your friends. Please rate and review the podcast. Check out GSMC Podcast Network. We appreciate it here. I certainly love you guys. Thanks again for listening, everybody. I'm your host, Kevin Mahalik. I'll talk to you guys again on Thursday.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.